How do you live with that? How do you possibly endure this excruciating torment? And yet that's exactly what Job is experiencing. But the deepest agony is not what's happened to his family and to his possessions and to his health. The deepest agony is that God has done this to him. And that's what you see in verses 9 and following. Notice how he over and over refers to God. God assails me and tears me in His anger and gnashes His teeth at me. Verse 10, people open their mouths and they jeer at me. They strike my cheek in scorn and unite together against me. Why? Because God has turned me over to the ungodly and thrown me into the clutches of the wicked. All was well with me, but He, God, shattered me. He seized me by the neck and He crushed me. He, God, has made me His target. His archers surround me. Without pity, He pierces my kidneys and spills my gall upon the ground. You see, the pain of losing his family was excruciating, but the spiritual anguish of losing his God is even worse. He's being assaulted by the God he once worshipped, the God he adored, the God he trusted in, and did everything in his power to obey and honor. God had been his life, and now God is seemingly his death. Now this is where I find just far too often commentators and preachers making a tragic mistake, and people making a mistake by saying that Job is blaming the wrong person here. That he's ascribing all these things to God, but it's not God's fault. I just heard a sermon again this week by a very well-known, dearly loved, very reformed pastor and theologian and professor at well-known seminary. And in his sermon on this text, he just said, Job, you're wrong. God didn't do these things to you. Satan did them. You've got the wrong person in view. God had nothing whatsoever to do with it. Now, I don't know how you can possibly say that God had nothing whatsoever to do with it. Of course, Satan is involved, but it is God. Remember God who said to Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? God calls Job to Satan's attention, and it was God who gave Job into Satan's hand, and Job himself immediately recognized it. So when all these calamities happened, Job didn't say, the Lord has given and Satan has taken away. The Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. We have to stop. If we're going to understand this book, if we're going to see the beauty of it and the profound truth of it, we have to stop trying to get God off the hook when it comes to Job's suffering. If we say that Satan did it, that's just as comfortless as the system. There's no comfort there. If our trials are not from God's hand, but from the devil's hand, what comfort will you possibly find in that? It just means, you see, that you're a helpless victim in the hand of your enemy. And it raises the most basic question. Well, who actually is running the universe? If God is just standing by watching the devil destroy you, how could we say that He actually does care at all? Or if He does care, how could we say that He is sovereignly ordaining whatsoever comes to pass? Is He or isn't He? Does He ordain all things? And does He do it out of love for His people or not? You see, to deny that God has done these things to Job it's just to refute Job's own believing testimony and rob him of the only ultimate comfort he's going to find and empty this book of its deepest truth. God did this to Job. That is precisely the tension of the book. That's the traumatic truth that's meant to grab your attention. And the trauma is compounded. Not only did God do this to Job, He did this to Job, His most beloved servant. And not only did He do it to His most beloved servant, He did it though Job was innocent. Job was innocent. That's the incomprehensible mystery of this story. How can it be possible that the infinitely righteous God who only does what is just and right, how can it be possible that God does these awful things to His most obedient servant? Which God testifies to. He's the one who says, there was no one like Job who is blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. And yet God does these things to that man. God crushed him, though Job was blameless. What amazes me about this book, Job, is that here we have, around the time of Abraham, a man whose experiences point with such perfect clarity to the suffering of Christ. There's not a more descriptive illustration in all the Old Testament. Listen to Job's words again in verse 10 and following, as they prophetically point with incredible clarity, 2,000 years at least before Jesus comes, to the experiences of Jesus. Verse 10, people open their mouths to jeer at me. They strike my cheek in scorn and unite together against me. God has turned me over to the ungodly and thrown me into the clutches of the wicked. It's exactly what happened to Jesus. As God hands Jesus over to the ungodly, to wicked Ananias and godless Pilate and the jeering soldiers who beat on him. We're told that in Mark 15. They put a purple robe on him, Jesus, and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, hail, King of the Jews." And you know that they just erupted in laughter, in mockery. And then they would take their fist and they would just beat him in the face. And they'd take the staff and they'd beat him over the head and they'd spit in his face. "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they led him out to crucify him. Job's testimony in verse 12 is precisely fulfilled in the experience of Christ. All was well with me. But He, God, shattered me. He seized me by the neck and crushed me. Who crushed Jesus? God did.